So we're going to have our last presentation of the day. Intangible cultural heritage and ecological humanities, indigenous cultures of the Caribbean and the Pacific. This is the title of the presentation that will be delivered by Dr. Elizabeth DeLoughrey, who is a professor at the Department of English at UCLA. Dr. DeLoughrey is responsible for also English as well as sustainable and environmental management. She focuses on decolonization as well as related theory coordination. She is also a joint editor-in-chief for Humanities-related Journal. Please welcome the speaker with a big round of applause.
Thank you so much for this invitation and the honor of speaking at the ICH Forum. I speak to you from Los Angeles, where COVID-19 is ravaging our communities, while the wildfires are ravaging our forests, our homes, and our air quality. In this constant theme of gratitude, I'm grateful for the breath that I used to take for granted and the opportunity to speak to the importance of framing our current crisis as a cultural and historical one. Thus, through attention to culture, we can begin to mitigate the suffering and forge new sustainable futures of livability, as Professor Park has emphasized. Our current climate crisis, termed the Anthropocene, has been tied to the history of capitalism, of empire, nuclear testing, and a globalization era of disposability and of waste. All of these histories have impacted tropical islands to a far greater extent than their continental counterparts, because islands have often functioned as laboratories for colonial experimentation, from the plantation complex to nuclear testing in the Pacific. The climate crisis alerts us to the peril of living beyond our limits, yet islanders have long had to negotiate ecological crisis, as well as find innovative solutions of sustainability and resilience in bounded lands and with limited resources. In a crisis about our Earth Island, island writers and artists prove a prescient perspective about the part's relationship to the whole. This is why we need the arts and the humanities to learn from our past and to chart the way for our Anthropocene futures. In an era of truly global environmental crisis, we cannot afford to overlook narratives from those island regions that are at the forefront of ecological change. So let's begin with our Earth Island, an extraterritorial view of the planet made possible by the satellite technologies developed in the Cold War, a battle that, while largely invisible to many people of the globe, was violently propagated in the small atolls of the Pacific. The myth of the island isolate, adopted by ecologists and anthropologists alike, helped to justify the detonation of hundreds of thermonuclear weapons in the atolls of the Marshall Islands and in French Polynesia. In selecting atolls for nuclear detonations, the island was treated as metonymic of the terraqueous globe. These are the remains of the first thermonuclear weapon test, Mike, which created a 1,900-meter wide crater and a mushroom cloud 40 kilometers high and 160 kilometers wide. Blowing up the island was understood in a part-the-whole relationship in which one could make predictions for the destruction of the Earth. The radiation from Test Bravo, which you see here as a crater, a 15-megaton hydrogen weapon detonated in 1954, permeated the global atmosphere, creating the world's first modern environmental refugees, and catalyzed the field of atmospheric chemistry. Due to the global distribution of radioactivity, scientists for the first time began to study radioactive carbon in the 1950s, giving us the historical data that we use in tracking CO2 emissions today. While the Pacific Islands were used as laboratories and were at the vanguard of new technologies of weaponry, high-speed cameras, color film, radiocarbon dating, and developments in ecology, the islands were consistently denied their imbrication with the globe, interpolated as isolated and primitive in the films and documents of the Atomic Energy Commission. And this is George, nuclear test George from Operation Greenhouse. The emergent field that is called the environmental humanities brings these conversations forward, raising visibility about this little-known history of the Cold War, as well as to help us understand the importance of storytelling and creative responses to crises of slow violence. One of the contradictions of climate change is that the science, which measures the deep time of the Earth's systems and makes projections far into the future, is not commensurate with the everyday experience of humans and their observation of weather. This creates a disjunction between experience and of data. To go back to the opening image of my presentation, there's a breakdown in the relationship between the part and the whole as figured through island and Earth. Climate facts arise from impersonal observation, whereas meanings emerge from embedded experience. We need to bring meaning and embedded experience into the picture of how we discuss science and advocate for climate justice. In order to bring the scales of climate and weather together, the visualization of climate change and its narratives is crucial to produce both evidence but also empathy. Therefore, visual images and stories of stranded polar bears on ice floes or Pacific Islanders wading through flooded villages become the means by which we are able to recognize, empathize, and perhaps even become inspired to mitigate climate change. My research in the environmental humanities has helped me understand that we need more attention to the kinds of stories we tell about crisis. Scholars suggest that dystopic modes of storytelling can create apocalypse fatigue, but many stories about the Pacific Islands by outsiders lean more towards the pastoral, creating a sense of nostalgia for a dying indigenous culture. After 2000, a dozen or so English language documentaries sought to depict the crisis of Pacific Islanders in relation to climate change, particularly sea level rise and its potential to create a new wave of climate refugees. In this group of films, the island becomes a symbol for the planetary future, and that these atolls are the canaries in the coal mine of atmospheric pollution and represent the Earth as a whole. Yet these films open the question as to how indigenous peoples of the islands can also be active participants in the storytelling process. In these films, Pacific Islanders are depicted as the harbingers of climate change, rendered as figures of an isolated, natural, and nature-loving culture. For instance, in Paradise Drowned, Tuvalu, the Disappearing Nation, it features the caption, "See the world's most endangered country." The Disappearing of Tuvalu, Trouble in Paradise from 2004, and then there's also There Was Once an Island. Generally speaking, and there are many more, there are probably 10 others that came out in this time period. Generally speaking, these documentaries tell the story in predictable ways. The films focus on village life, feature ample images of the ocean, people fishing, children running on the beach, sunset, palm trees, and then images of flooding homes and interviews with subjects who are considering migrating to Australia or New Zealand. Atoll life is quite beautifully imagined in the romantic light of the setting sun of the ocean, reflecting what the film suggests is a dying culture. This dying culture is at once the death of a pastoral past as well as the planet's future. The keywords of the films, evidenced by their titles, are paradise, disappearance, and endangerment, remarkably like the kind of extinction narratives about non-human species. The film's nostalgia is particular to a long history of colonial South Seas discourse, in which travel narratives, paintings, and later films aestheticize an idyllic island lifestyle imagined outside of modernity, history, empire, and labor. This tropical paradise narrative is evident in the Time and Tide website as well. The heart-wrenching and beautiful film Time and Tide is like one of Gauguin's rare found object sculptures, simultaneously celebrating a precious Edenic time and place while calling attention to the fact that it is perhaps lost forever. So the salvage narrative that once helped authorize funding for a generation of anthropologists in the Pacific is now catalyzing a new generation of journalists, filmmakers, and scholars who fly across the world to descend on Kiribati, Tuvalu, and Tokelau to interrogate the residents about nothing but climate change. Nature in these films is an agent capable of producing change, but the islander is too often depicted as passive victim. In this era of what geographer Mike Hume calls neo-environmental determinism, climate becomes variable, but human behavior is not. In these films, the possibilities of human agency are relegated to footnotes, the changing cultural norms and practices are made invisible, and the creative potential of the human imagination is ignored. We need new stories generated from the islanders themselves that do not idealize atoll life, but bring out its complexities and contradictions. In turning to the arts and humanities, we find a diversity of human narratives that challenge notions of climate determinism. I conclude with the performance poem because it offers a far more complex narrative form that does not idealize a South Seas pastoral and suggest the webs of obligation that connect us across the sea. The root of obligation is ligar, which is to bond or to tie or to weave. The Marshallese poet Kathy Jetnell-Kishner is now well known for her poetic address to the United Nations, but I want to go back to this performance recorded at the 2012 Olympics Poetry Parnassus, which does not employ an aerial god's eye view of the tropical atoll, but actually places the poet high above the audience with the cold, stormy skies of London swirling behind her. Her poem invokes some of the same imagery that are in the documentaries. There's fine white sand, there are sweet harmonies of songs, and there are papaya golden sunsets. But she immediately juxtaposes what might initially be considered idyllic with everyday modernities, like an island clogged with chugging cars and styrofoam cups of Kool-Aid. Her poem here foregrounds a story about a gifted basket, and it is about weaving together connections and obligations across the Pacific and well beyond. These bonds are legally established with the Compact of Free Association Micronesian states have with the United States, which grew out of the 1946 annexation of Micronesia in order to develop a base for its military and to conduct 3 decades of nuclear testing, which poisoned and displaced thousands of Marshallese. In the poem, Jetnell-Kishner offers her American friends a gift, handcrafted jewels from the sea, black pearls and cowrie shell earrings placed in hand-woven baskets, products of women's love and of labor. Inside this basket is a message for the reader or viewer to pass on. You tell them, she implores, where these gifts came from, the Marshall Islands, and ask the reader to show them where it is on a map. She fashions her poetry as a basket, which in turn is a metaphor for the island. Emphasizing the ways in which earrings in the basket she has made for her audience travel, like her words, the poet creates new webs of obligation and a new allegory for the Anthropocene. Ending the poem with the defiant, we don't, we've never, and we are nothing without our islands, Jetnell-Kishner refuses to accede to discourses of extinction and migration. And in that refusal, places the obligation on the reader to determine an alternative plot. In these webs of obligation, we are held accountable for our worldwide crisis of climate change. I will leave the poet to conclude, and here we will play the video.
I prepared the package for my friends in the States. The dangling earrings woven into half moons, black pearls glinting like an eye in a storm of tight spirals. The baskets, sturdy, also woven, brown cowrie shell shiny, intricate mandalas shaped by calloused fingers. Inside the basket, I write a message. Wear these earrings to parties, to classes and meetings, to the corner store, the grocery store, and while riding the bus. Store jewelry, incense, copper coins, and curling letters like this one in this basket. And when others ask you where you got this, you tell them they're from the Marshall Islands. Show them where it is on a map. Tell them we are a proud people toasted dark brown as the carved ribs of a tree stump. Tell them we are descendants of the finest navigators in the world. Tell them our islands were dropped from a basket carried by a giant. Tell them we are the hollow hulls of canoes as fast as the wind slicing through the Pacific Sea. We are wood shavings and drying pandanus leaves and siquipiros at kemems. Tell them we are the sweet harmonies of mothers, aunties, sisters, songs late into night. Tell them we are whispered prayers, the breath of God, a crown of fuchsia flowers encircling Antimedes' white seafoam hair. Tell them we are styrofoam cups of Kool-Aid red, waiting patiently for the Ilomid. We are papaya golden sunsets bleeding into a glittering open sea. We are skies uncluttered, majestic and sweeping in their landscape. We are the ocean, terrifying and regal in its power. Tell them we are dusty rubber slippers swiped from concrete doorsteps. We are the ripped seams and the broken door handles of taxis. We are sweaty hands shaking another sweaty hand in heat. Tell them we are days and nights hotter than anything you can imagine. Tell them we are little girls with braids, cartwheeling beneath the rain. We are shards of broken beer bottles burrowed beneath fine, white sand. We are children, flinging like rubber bands across a road clogged with chugging cars. Tell them we only have one road. And after all this, tell them about the water, how we have seen it rising, flooding across our cemeteries, gushing over our seawalls, and crashing against our homes. Tell them what it's like to see the entire ocean level with the land. Tell them we are afraid. Tell them we don't know of the politics or the science, but we see what is in our own backyard. Tell them some of us are old fishermen who believe that God made us a promise. Tell them some of us are a little bit more skeptical of God. But most importantly, tell them we don't want to leave. We've never wanted to leave. And that we are nothing without our islands.